transition to program coordinator out of Drac Twidwell's lab while I finish up my PhD here at UNL. What I'm going to do today is present on some data we collected last summer. Hold on one second. I'm trying to move my stuff around. So some data we collected last summer on effective seed dispersal of eastern red cedar. This data has been, really important to some new guidelines for managing woody encroachment more broadly in the Great Plains. So really excited to be able to share kind of the data behind some of these new guidelines. All right, so let me just start with woody encroachment, really framing it as a global problem in our grasslands. This isn't a local problem. This isn't a Eastern Nebraska problem or even a Nebraska problem. Woody encroachment throughout our grassy biomes globally is well documented. What this study showed over the last 20 years is that increases in tree cover is the biggest change in vegetation functional groups over the last 20 years. So definitely not something that we're just concerned about here in Nebraska, but really a national threat in our range. And so what we've seen with, I guess one important thing to point out here is that we're seeing these large changes in tree cover despite substantial investments. So investments of hundreds of millions of dollars being put into encroachment, and we're still seeing these large changes in our grasslands. So what new approaches have aimed to do is go from managing using these arbitrary cover thresholds. So let's say we will start managing, or we'll start cost sharing the management of eastern red cedar at 10% cover or 1% cover or 5% cover, to an approach that emphasizes reducing risk and vulnerability. So when we talk about reducing risk and vulnerability, we can actually, if we understand what makes the grassland vulnerable, we can start management before the problems arise. We can actually prevent grasslands from being vulnerable and those resources from being lost. And so before I dive into our study and the data, I just want to kind of talk about where this fits in this new framework for managing risk and vulnerability. So there's three components that make grasslands vulnerable to eastern red cedar encroachment. That's sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Sensitivity describes the rate at which a grassland experiences transition to woody encroachment. So think of things like fire. Typically, historically, fire maintained grasslands with low vulnerability to encroachment because there was that fire there that prevented those demographic transitions. It did consume seeds, it consumed seedlings, it consumed mature trees. So their system had little sensitivity to encroachment in the first place. We also have things like climate, soil grazing. All of these are factors that influence how sensitive a grassland is to encroachment. Then we have exposure. Exposure is really simple, especially for species like eastern red cedar, which are seed obligates. So they require seed to reproduce and spread. Seed is the biological source of the problem for encroachment. Then we have adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity describes the ability to adapt to a threat or problem. So cost share programs or prescribed burn associations, or even more simply, neighbors working together, builds adaptive capacity. We're talking about moving from managing a problem within a local property to larger scales like county or region. The goal of this study was to better understand grassland exposure to eastern red cedar encroachment. So there's a lot of things we already know about exposure, but there's some critical gaps in our information that really prevent us from effectively operationalizing some of these models that aim at minimizing exposure and sensitivity. So let me just kind of quick run through a few of these because I know there's been some questions throughout the conference on some of these metrics. So when we're thinking about seed production, we've got that how long it takes from a seedling to become a seed-bearing tree. Research from Kansas shows that happens in about 6 to 7 years is the fastest. Once mature, a female tree can produce over 1.5 million seeds in a year. That's based on research out of Virginia. How far are those seeds going to be dispersed? We know that the majority of them are dispersed away from the tree canopy by birds into the adjacent grassland. There was a study in Virginia that looked at collected bird droppings along a fence line, and it showed that the maximum predicted distance for a seed to go was 515 meters. Now, this was for Virginia, and it was along a fence line. And so we might expect those numbers to be different in the Great Plains, where we have different disperser communities, so different avian communities are going to be dispersing those seeds. And then two are just our grasslands are at different scales than what we would expect in Virginia. Effective dispersal, that's the distance, really that tracks the distance of recruitment events. So it's like seed dispersal, only it takes those dispersal events that actually result in seed germination. There's been no research on that. That's where we kind of fit in today. But then the last one is important too for the managers here is seed bank longevity. There's been 2 studies on this. The first shows that 5.5% of seeds are viable after 14 months from dispersal. That's based on a Virginia study. The Nebraska study kind of conferred with that one, with 3% of seeds viable after 28 months. So not a very persistent seed bank. These numbers are very, very low compared to other species. But really, if we want to manage exposure spatially, we need to know more information on effective dispersal. And so the objectives of this study were, number one, to determine effective seed dispersal distances for eastern red cedar. And then two, we wanted to characterize the development of a woody encroachment leading edge into a treeless prairie over time. So think about this as like the front lines of a woody transition. We wanted to know, how they start and then how they evolve and change over time. And so today, these will be the 2 objectives that I focus on. All right, so we selected 2 study sites. And I guess I'll just say, like, one of the biggest challenges of picking a study site was where we can study an undisturbed encroachment process that hasn't actually already gotten to so far along that we can't measure that maximum dispersal distance. And so we turned to our Nebraska National Forest. We had National Forest at Halsey and Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest. These 2 sites are home to some of the first tree planting experiments in the Sandhills. Really have an interesting history on the history of shelter belts and tree planting in the Great Plains as a whole. But with these sites, we're actually able to take some of the first shelter belts and tree plantings in the state and then measure the encroachment process into what was formerly a treeless prairie. And so what we did at each site is we took 5 transects. Transects range from 1 to 5 kilometers, so they're very large transects. And what we did to place these is we found a treeless grassland, an area that was at least 515 meters from the nearest tree. We used that as a starting point. And then we drew a line to the nearest planted seed source. So in this case, a shelter belt. Actually, in all cases, it was a shelter belt. And we use this to measure kind of that front line of an encroachment process into a treeless prairie. And so transects range from 1 to 5 kilometers. They were 100 meters wide. Within the transect, we identified all the trees. Within a boundary area, that's 500 meters, we identified all the potential seed sources. So with this study, we wanted to track every tree and be able to point to where that tree came from. And so, for example, I guess I'll get to it on the next slide. But with this approach, so within transects, take these seedlings, for example, we wanted to identify the nearest seed source. If that seed source happened to be outside of our transect area, we also marked that tree. And so what we ended up collecting was a data set of about 1,000 species or 1,000 trees, recording tree height, sex, whether they were a cone producing, a male, female, or unsexable, and then how tall they were. This allowed us to relate back a potential seed source for every tree marked, ending with the windbreak at the start of the transect. So for our analyses, what we did with this data set is we went in and we calculated distances to a potential seed source, or the closest seed source for every tree. And then we calculated these effective dispersal kernels, or basically what you see here is a standard approach for calculating seed dispersal kernels, which is essentially uses a probability density function to create a distribution that reflects seed dispersal in one dimension from a seed source. So we tested log normal, Weibull, and exponential. These are 3 commonly used seed dispersal functions. We used AIC to test which one was the best, and then assess model fit to kind of approximate what that effective seed dispersal curve was for eastern red cedar. For our second objective, remember, we wanted to characterize the leading edge of encroachment over time. And so what we did here is we took encroachment from the original seed source, or the windbreak, and then we used tree size as a proxy for time here. And so what we did is we started with the tallest trees, and we looked at the distribution of the tallest trees in relation to that windbreak. And we created a dispersal kernel for time 1. Then we added in more trees, the shorter ones. So let's say we started with trees that were 5 meters and taller. Next, we added in trees that were 4 meters and taller as a proxy for time step 2. We created a probability density function for that. We repeated this process until we had all the data in as kind of a proxy for how the encroachment leading edge evolves and develops over time. All right, so diving into the results, effective seed dispersal. This shows a histogram of the raw data. And so what we see is majority of dispersals occurring, real close to the nearest seed source, but we see this long tail. So we ended up having a log normal distribution come out by far being the best in describing effective seed dispersal curve. And what's significant about that is it's a fat-tailed distribution. And so what we get is this strong peak here and then a long tail. And so this is consistent with other species in that we have fat-tailed dispersal. And so what we see is the majority of our dispersals occurring within about 200 meters of a seed source.
Down to just a couple minutes, Dillon.
Okay. What this shows is probability. So it shows what percent of recruitment occurs per distance. So we see this huge jump right away. 90% of recruitments occurring at 90 meters. 95% of recruitments occurring at 157 meters. So after that point, we really see this flat line where we have these long distance rare recruitment events. All right, so moving on to objective 2, we've got the development of a leading edge over time. So think of this dispersal or this cumulative density function showing percentiles here. So say we have that dispersal curve and we take the 50th percentile and plot it, the 75th percentile and plot it, the 90th percentile and plot it, and then the 95th. We can see this is where the peak would be, and this is our fat tail. This is for our trees over 5 meters tall. So this is kind of the start of that encroachment progression from a seed source. As we add in the smaller trees as our proxy for further time steps, we kind of see the progression of how that encroachment leading edge changes over time. And what's really interesting is we've got our peak shown kind of here in green and pink. Think of this as your high density encroachment zone, where you're having that active transition from grass to tree dominance. We see it moving really slowly over time, just inching out. But when we look at our tail, we see it making big jumps as we add in more trees. And so slow movement of that kind of woody transition or that high density zone, really quick movement of that tail. So we're having these rare dispersal events where we're having trees colonize formerly treeless grasslands. Some really simple management implications. The first kind of dispels this notion that we can't manage exposure to this problem. We absolutely can. We can manage grassland exposure to eastern red cedar. 95% of recruitment occurs within 200 yards of the seed source. We've all heard, we can manage football fields. What this is going to require to manage exposure or seed source to seed dispersal is, number one, treatments that don't leave behind seed-bearing trees. We can't manage exposure if we have seed sources everywhere. And then number two, if we need integrated approaches that account for short and long distance recruitment events. And so I showed that we know that over 95% of recruitment occurs within 2 football fields of a seed source. We can manage that. That's something that can be managed under a high maintenance boundary management philosophy. We also showed that those long distance recruitment events do occur and they can be important, but they're more amenable to an early detection rapid response approach. And I think the second big implication here is that, as we're restoring grasslands and building these really large, or restoring these large treeless areas, it's going to be increasingly important that we manage those rare recruitment events. Because what can happen is if they might be rare, but we get a recruitment event, say 900 meters into a treeless prairie. Over time, that can compromise large-scale efforts by creating an additional seed source and this new foci for encroachment in what's being managed as if it was a treeless grassland. All right, one thing, because I'm sure I'm out of time here. I just wanted to show a boots on the ground example from the Nebraska National Forest. And so this shows the Halsey property. This is the forested footprint. This shows the grassland around that in 2010 was in an encroached state. It contained mature encroaching trees. By 2020, and this is bigger now and extends on private properties if we're to look in 2021, but they've got this really awesome integrative management approach where they're actually creating treeless areas. So they're not leaving behind seed sources. They're depleting the seed bank, and then they're managing these large treeless areas by implementing fire every 6 years. So what that does is it manages the boundary zone, and it also at the same time manages for those rare dispersal events within the core of their property. Not to mention all of the additional benefits to grassland wildlife from using prescribed fire. All right, thank you, and sorry for going a minute or two over.